Welcome to Feedstuffs 365 and National Hog Farmer. I'm Ann Hess. Commercial pig production has undergone significant improvements in genetics, nutrition, housing, and management. However, sow retention remains a key factor limiting herd efficiency and profitability. Retaining sows for additional parities reduces replacement costs and enhances herd stability. However, early removal remains a multifactorial and often misunderstood process. Joining us to discuss this topic and more from the International Conference on Pig Livability is Dr. Ely Kirwa, your Iowa State University. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Before we jump into today's conversation, I'd like to remind the audience, if you're tuning in, you can post your questions there in the chat, or if you're tuning in via social media, you can post those there in the comments. So, Dr. Kirwa, let's set the stage for us on sow mortality and why this seems to be so problematic around parity 3 or 4.
Thanks again. Sow mortality in general is not, it's restricted to parity 3 and 4, but parity 3 and 4 is where optimal performance of a sow is expected to pay its return. So currently the industry experience about 2022 data reveals that its mortality is risen to 20%, but 2024 there was a slight decline in that. But we still see that more sows are removed before parity 3 and parity 4, and that's where we get the optimal performance in terms of paying the bills.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you recently conducted a study here in the Midwest associated with gilt retention within a production system. What were some key objectives you were hoping to achieve from this study?
Yeah, so our main objective was to assess the factors associated with gilt retention in breeding herds in one of the biggest breeding system, or rather production system in the Midwest. And so this was mainly two outcomes: to be able to determine what are the drivers of retention at parity 1 and at parity 3, which I mentioned initially that's when we expect the pig or the sow to have paid back its due. And so for the findings you asked, the main drivers for it at parity 1 and parity 3, most of them are associated with, as we know, sow longevity or sow retention is a multifactorial aspect, and so it's not driven by a single factor, but rather environmental, structural, health, as well as also management factors. So the main drivers actually were age and weight at first service, including structural information such as filtration status of the farm, but also health status including PER stability, or rather exposure to PERs in the lifetime of a pig.
I don't think we can go to a conference without talking about PERs having some impact here. What factors, I guess, were the most surprising to you when it came to gilt retention?
I think most of the factors being said is correlated to each other. For example, PER status was significant as correlated with filtration status. So we find that in our findings, filtered farms actually had a higher retention as compared to non-filtered farms. On the other hand, rather stable herds that were kept stable during the entire lifetime had a significantly higher retention rate as compared to either consistently endemic herds or herds that had an outbreak at any time of their lifetime.
How about disease status? How did that influence gilt retention?
Yeah, as mentioned, we looked at different risk factors. In terms of health, we looked at PER status, mycoplasma exposure, as well as Seneca Valley virus. PER status was a key disease contributor to as a major risk factor of retention. In essence, as mentioned, sows that experience an outbreak gilts that experience an outbreak in part of their life had a significantly lower retention as compared to stable herds. And this actually reflects on exposure stages. So animals that get exposed continuously at different stages, because we did not look at one time point of exposure, but this is lifetime exposure. If a gilt is exposed to PERS at parity 1, but survives and moves on to parity 2 and parity 3, we find that actually most of those herds do not proceed beyond parity 3.
They built up some immunity then.
they do build up some immunity, but the impact of an outbreak and be able to recover, as we know with the dynamics of PRRS and the disease cause in itself, it can persist in a herd for a very long time. And so most of the gilts do not get, or rather do not recover, and we lose most of the gilts post an outbreak.
How about different types of systems such as GDUs and open pen gestation? Did you find differences there?
Thanks for the question. That was one of the surprising, I would say, results we have in this specifically to this system. We found that pen gestation, open pen gestation, had a 4% higher retention rate as compared to stall gestation. This is contrary to other findings in different studies. This is because of group housing is prone to pigs fighting all the time, and different studies have illustrated that actually pen gestation is associated with a reduced in retention, even higher mortalities due to that group housing problems. But specifically, the reason why I say this result is actually unique to this system is because of how they handle sows in group housing, and so they have dedicated staff to be able to handle that, and we can explain the unexpected result by the dedication of the staff to the specific pen housing as compared to the stalls. Although it's also worth noting that most of the sow farms that combine GDU and pen housing in the same farm.
So that extra set of eyes, is that making a difference?
Correct. Extra set of eyes is always needed in the sow farm, as much as labor is a big consideration operation-wise. But having a dedicated care, this has also been demonstrated in systems that use 100% pen gestation. That pen gestation works only if the extra care is there to watch the bullying sows, or sows that are being bullies in the pen.
So from this research, what would you say are some key takeaways for producers?
The key takeaways will be managing age and weight at first service. We found that breeding younger gilts have a higher retention. Younger, all recommended, as we looked at categories recommended by the genetics, and younger gilts perform breeding younger age, which is between 29 and 34 weeks, at a higher retention rate. Additionally, keeping your herd stable in terms of PRRS exposure, just long term you have a higher retention. And finally, weight was only significant at parity 3. This is because the weight in this system was measured by tape, and also being the weight and age are pretty much correlated. As we looked at our data set distribution, sows that were actually performing poorly were the older animals, and the heavy animals bred in the sow farm accordingly.
So as the industry continues to strive to reduce sow mortality, what's next for research in this area for you?
In this area of sow mortality and sow longevity in general, we acquiring more data and applying different approaches of analytics. So this was mainly a regression analysis, so we are moving towards predictive analysis, applying different machine learning algorithms to be able to determine what are the predictors of sow longevity. And in essence, we are collaborating with different partners to be able to follow gilts from parity, from gilt state to parity 1 to later parities, and be able to estimate these impact on the drivers using or rather advanced statistical approaches, including machine learning.
Dr. Ely Kirwa, Iowa State University, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insight.
I appreciate it. Appreciate you having me here, and appreciate the invitation. Thank you.
We thank you and the audience for tuning in. For more coverage and conversations from the International Conference on Pig Livability, be sure to check out the Feedstuffs and National Hog Farmer websites, as well as our social media channels. For Feedstuffs and National Hog Farmer, I'm Ann Hess.